Well, thank you so much for the welcome, Art and Nariana and Karen. I think it's great to be here. As I say, this is our third HCRC conference. There's been 4 here at the bank, since 2003, and we're really excited with this topic, in particular in terms of the work that we're doing, and just great. And I think if you look out at the field, and I think one of the things, the pattern, sort of the need that really does cry out in the field is how to better sustain early learning gains, and how to engage in the public schools and also in communities to ensure that we can be more successful in reaching, having individuals reach their potential, so that when we see high school graduation rates at age 18, 19, that they're going to be much higher than they are today. And I think what I wanted to kind of just lay out for you is some of the background and some of the context, just on on the HCRC, but also just on the field. As I say, in the HCRC, we've been doing this for about 10 years. 2006, 10 years. It seems like just yesterday, Art. And we've been sort of dance partners, but Art's a little bit better dancer than I am. But maybe I could probably take him on the basketball court, though. But on the other hand, the idea we've done a lot together, and I think in the conference the theme is really this partnership between the University of Minnesota. I just want to highlight too that I think the Humphrey School of Public Affairs, the College of Education and Human Development, and particularly the Institute of Child Development, coming together in collaboration, with the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis, is unique. I think it's a unique partnership. And this idea is to promote effective public policies for young children through multidisciplinary research and outreach, and also through the design, implementation, dissemination of programs and practices to enhance well-being. And so the areas we focus on, obviously, as Art mentioned, and Ariana as well, that a focus in our work is on cost-benefit analysis. In the HCRC, we're looking at sort of the predictors and the processes of well-being. From early on in life, from the early years in life, prenatal all the way up to early adulthood and beyond. Program development implementation. We've been privileged as the last 3 or 4 years as our scale up of the Midwest Child Parent Center continues, we've been immersed in some of the program development implementation work, in the field, which has been very exciting. And also looking at, general policy analysis questions, whether about, the briefs about, quality and the impact of, duration, intensity, and child development outcomes. And you can see in the panel on the back table as you go out there, we have some of the previous books and some of the briefs that we work on that focus on those efforts as well. And of course, longitudinal analysis of interventions. There's going to be a lot of that covered today. In addition to the work that we've done, of course, on the Chicago Longitudinal Study, Chicago Child Parent Centers, we've also looked at data from ECHLS, from the Abecedarian Project, from the Perry Preschool Project, IHDP. Many of the major longitudinal studies that have been looked at, examined, have been a real big focus. So this idea of, why gains, sustaining gains are so important. And I think I want to lay out really that there's 5 reasons. And when you think about gains, that this notion of gains, that we want to enhance the impact of existing programs and services that have been invested in. There's been huge investments in the last few years, federally and states, to really promote this focus. We will also want to help reduce the risk of drop-off and effects. I prefer myself the term drop-off rather than fade-out, because there is a, kind of a reduction that occurs, but we can prevent that reduction. This idea of also we want to improve progress and just improving achievement and reducing gaps, generally, irregardless of intervention. And also a focus, I think the other focus on why sustaining gains, that reinforces this focus attention on effectiveness, the program effectiveness and exemplary programs, effective programs, high quality programs. I think when we think about sort of sustaining gains, we're sort of, presuming that there are gains there to begin with, but we're also saying that, we really value and, want to promote those gains. So I think it's a reinforcement effect that's also, part of the messaging that we have to do. And also the issue about increasing the return on investment. I think if we sustain gains, we're going to be more likely to certainly see the gains later on. I want to give some examples of these 5 points. If we think about just in the last 5 years or so, if I added up all the new investments, both federally and states, maybe over $800 or $900 million. I think some of the biggest categories. Certainly new investments in early childhood, and we want to make sure these investments have value and have effects. Think about some of the increases in state pre-K and Head Start. The state of Minnesota, and the recent budget just passed, $100 million in new investments in Head Start, school readiness dollars, and also in scholarships that I think we want to promote and make sure that we see those continued gains. The federally sponsored preschool development grants, also over the next 4 years they will pump in $800 or $900 million to states to develop and implement full-day pre-K programs for 4-year-olds. Early Childhood Challenge grants that also been sponsored that the state has received, state of Minnesota has received, and other states that focus on really building the systems of care and education as well are also really important. And I think some of the work in the Investing Innovation Fund that was started by Secretary Arne Duncan, is also a way to kind of foster these efforts about innovation. And for example, the I-3 project, the Child Parent Center Expansion, is one of the Investing in Innovation projects as well. And it's sort of a new funding mechanism sort of called social impact bonds or pay for success, has 2 already examples of preschool investments being made through the social impact bond financing. One in Utah, the Utah preschool program, and also that recently the city of Chicago just expanded child parent centers based on the CPC model that we're going to be discussing more at this conference. So let me just give you some examples about why sustaining gains is important. One, just to generally increase achievement across the board. Showing you NAEP data from 4th grade, you see the trend line here from 2005 to 2013, seeing the percent proficient on NAEP proficiency, reading proficiency in 4th grade, sort of the nation's report card. And it shows even those children and families above 185% of the poverty line, only about 50% are proficient on the NAEP reading test. And if you look at kids that are poor, low income or poor families, it's only about 20%. And so obviously, as we accelerate learning gains in those early years, the idea to sustain those gains is that we need to raise these levels of proficiency. And if we don't sustain the gains, we're going to have a lower likelihood of reaching sort of the goals that we have. And I'm thinking at a minimum, certainly, we'd like to see those proficiency rates, over 75%. And so without sustained gains, we're going to be less likely, I think, to see that. Another thing about the drop-off in effects, now it's certainly not a certainty, but there is enough evidence out there that suggests that we're not necessarily getting the most out of our early childhood programs. And so a pattern that you see among those that show a drop-off is that beginning early on at age 5, you see that middle line, the dotted line, being sort of a common pattern of the drop-off, is that although at the beginning of kindergarten, at the end of kindergarten, you see gains relative, say, to other lower SES families with children from low-income families in early childhood programs, that pattern drops off a little bit, so that by 1st or 2nd, 3rd grade, you see a reduction, and so not a difference from really the starting point would be that initial blue line. And so the idea for early childhood is to reverse that pattern, is to have an effort that would make it more likely that those lines continue toward the upper end. And I think to anticipate these goals of sustaining early childhood gains, I think the CDC has gotten involved in sort of Healthy People initiative, Healthy People 2020, to really emphasize early childhood, middle childhood context, and that was a big change, I think, from the earlier Healthy People 2010. And one of the main goals in Healthy People, as described, is to increase the proportion of children who are ready for school in all 5 domains of healthy development as a dropping point. And if we increase those levels of readiness, then we'll be in a better position to continue and to enrich those gains later on. So what are some of the investment strategies that are used to sustain the gains that we're going to be talking about at the conference? Obviously, this morning we'll talk about this issue of sort of the early starting age, starting earlier, the duration, the dosage and intensity of intervention services. Are they optimal for what we need today in today's world. I would just point out, too, that if you look at nationally, at state pre-K programs, for example, only about, 20 to 30% of, pre-K programs funded through state pre-K are full-day programs. Most of them, almost all of them, or the majority of them, are part-day programs. If dosage and intensity and duration make a difference, then we need to sort of accelerate and better understand, the long-term effects of those kinds of investments. And that gets to dosage intensity. Certainly sort of a family-centered or a two-generational approach. Also bringing in the family parent involvement being a key part of that as well. Are other kinds of investments that have gone up in Head Start, early Head Start, and the like. And also we're looking at sort of, improving, general quality and effectiveness elements, whether it be, teacher qualifications, teacher-child interactions, the learning environments of preschool programs, class size, all of those kinds of things make a big difference as well. But there's also K-3 services that are important as well to continue those gains. So you think about this idea of reaching sort of the NAEP standard is going to require more than just a usual pre-K or even a good pre-K, that we need to kind of align these services through both curriculum alignment, the continuation of preschool services in kindergarten, in the early grades, more comprehensiveness of coverage in terms of health and social services, family services as well being promoted, and certainly a much bigger focus on professional development and teacher supports. And I think you have this sort of an alignment, and I guess the way I think about this is you align the early first 5 years with K to 3. There's sort of a synergy of putting those elements together, in a comprehensive picture. And I think the way we've looked about this in the HCRC with the Midwest CPC is putting that all together in sort of a, we're all advancing toward third grade achievement excellence. And the way we think about it is organizing these intervention services or program services from early ed that places an equal emphasis on preschool, kindergarten, the first to third grades. And under the rubric of these 6 key elements of effectiveness, from collaborative leadership to parent engagement. And I want to point out, too, just historically in the field, I'm going to talk a little about the history, but there have been a number of efforts, and many successful, in terms of so-called P3 intervention strategies. They've been developed since follow-through. I'm going to talk about that later today, but we have a follow-through developmental continuity, the Head Start Public School, a transition demonstration project that Craig and Sharon Ramey directed in the 90s. You have the CPC expansion. So I think we have a lot of knowledge about how to put these integrated efforts together, and that might be, I think, one of the lessons, that how do we do that better than what we've done. And I think in our expansion of the CPC program, we're trying to take those lessons to heart to really advance it further. And so now I want to give you just a little bit of a history. That's sort of some of the conceptual backdrop. But I think the way I've organized it, so you see sort of the integration of services. But now I want to take you through sort of an organization of sort of the history of what factors have been key in promoting gains, long-term gains to sustaining gains through a model that we developed maybe about 15 years ago, just to organize the literature and the history about what are the categories of and processes that need to be in place so that we can see these long-term effects later on. So it's called generally the 5 hypothesis model, but it really directs us to some of the strategies, the efforts that the sustainability paths that will make it more likely that we see these long-term gains. Thinking about developed abilities, motivational advantage, social emotional adjustment, family support, and school support. And I think in the extent to which early childhood programs incorporate these strategies, these mechanisms in their programming, the more likely they are to make gains. The larger the impact is on those 5 sort of processes, the more likely you are to see sustained gains. The more that K to 3 or K to 5 environments have these features present in terms of high quality, curriculum alignment, greater dosage of services, the more likely we are to see these long-term gains in terms of the competence behaviors and a whole host of those behaviors. And so I think the field's organized, itself around these 5 hypotheses. And this is just a way to sort of conceptualize the factors that we need to take into account. And each one is going to have a contribution, but the more our programs, any individual program can affect these simultaneously in a large way, the more likely we are to see these longer-term gains. So let me just take you sort of on a history tour of how these processes were identified. If we think about the early education field back in the 60s, when we started the sort of cognitive advantage, I think the work, sort of the naive environmentalism that came out of the early 60s in the early War on Poverty days, I think were well captured by Hunt and Bloom's sort of perspective on this continuum of developed abilities, that by changing IQ early on, that we can have these long-term effects that are going to address and sustain themselves through well-being and the like. I think about Hunt's other thing, that substantially higher adult levels of intellectual capacity can be achieved by providing quality encounters with the environment in the early years. And then Bloom had this extra pattern. The pattern is very rapid growth in intelligence in the early years, and the possible great influence on early environment, of the early environment on this development. And obviously, we've come a long way from this time, but this idea of this early cognitive advantage, still remains today as one pathway, one process that we can contribute. And so these are sort of the seeds of it. And now we try to measure this in a much more complex way, and not just through IQ tests, but through the whole continuum. Now, the family support hypothesis is sort of another one that came out of some of the early Head Start studies. I call this the Bronfenbrenner hypothesis, and what it really says is that the evidence indicates the child's family as an active participant is critical to the success of any intervention program. Without such family involvement, any effects of intervention appear to erode fairly rapidly once the program ends. So this idea of the context. And of course, this idea of the importance of sustaining children's learning is the involvement of the parents. Children's learning in the school is the involvement of the parents in supporting. At home, the activities engaged in by a child at school, and the participation activity at school directly affecting the child. And so the idea here is really, it's a family system that we're impacting in early child intervention, and if you're going to have longer-term effects, you must impact that system so those gains continue later on as well. So that's the Bronfenbrenner hypothesis. Now, there is a Ziegler hypothesis. We'll have to work on like a Rolnick or a Reynolds hypothesis next, but I think, but the idea from Ed's perspective was that these IQ changes, and this is from his paper, a great paper in the American Psychologist in 1978, but IQ changes resulting from preschool intervention programs reflect motivational changes that influence the children's test performance rather than the changes in the actual quality of cognitive functioning. And obviously there's a number of measures of that as well. But I think the perspective, and I've always been taken by that perspective, but the way that I think that Ed thought about it in the field of the motivational theorists thought about it was that having children, whatever cognitive or skills that children have, using them to the best of their ability, the use of those skills, the application of those skills is what can drive the sustainability of the gains. And so that, I think, is a key sort of antidote or sort of a complementary view about this sustainability. And obviously motivation, school commitment, and I think there's a lot of studies out there that show this value. In fact, some very recent studies by Robert Plomin showing this value added by motivation in twin studies above and beyond the influence of cognition and IQ factors. Social emotional adjustment, really, there's no real person's name on this one, but I think the idea that change is linked to improved competencies in social context of the classroom. We think about more executive functioning skills or rule following, meeting social norms, peer relationships, that these self-regulation, task orientation kinds of factors, that these kind of factors are more context-based, but not purely cognitive or not purely social, sort of an integration of those two together. And then as far as school support goes, the idea here is that certainly a function, the sustainability is a function of the quality and the continuity in the post-program environments and in instructional environments, including both teacher quality, classroom quality, instructional quality, not just the quality of the school. And there's a number of measures of that as well. And I think many of the early studies on Head Start, for example, show that these gains, that many children in Head Start go to lower quality schools, and that's what's driving a large percentage of the drop-off that you see. And on the other hand, in the work in our study, in Chicago Longitudinal Study, we show sort of an opposite pattern. The positive pattern is that kids that go to high-quality schools after the CPC program are more likely to see these longer-term sustained gains in adolescence and beyond. But we need to look at this in a broader way with lots of studies, lots of work, certainly a hypothesis in terms of what percentage of the sustainability of the gain that we see is going to be due to school support. It's going to be a mixture, obviously. It's going to be integration. There's a lot of complexity here. And I think I also want to give more attention, I think, to the Cornell Consortium for Longitudinal Studies in our work in looking at sustainability. I think it's a phenomenal study. This is a landmark study that many of us don't realize or work a lot on as well. These original 11 projects that came together began in 1975. Some of the initial results were coming out right at the time when a lot of the Head Start funding was being, criticized that Head Start wasn't working as well and was put in sort of the policy perspective. And so this was at Cornell. I think the master book was put together in 1983 as The Twig is Bent, Lasting Effects of Preschool Programs. And the idea here is really a diverse collection, so the evidence doesn't rest on any one program or one approach, but it's a combination of all 11 of these programs together. As many as 4,000 children followed. Some followed to adulthood. One of the projects was the Perry Preschool Project, and also Susan Gray's Tennessee study as well, some of the early projects, showing that these gains, these long-term sustained effects can be possible. Certainly these studies showed, for example, the early IQ effect, but they also showed the achievement effect, and they also showed for a few projects higher rates of high school graduation. And these were sort of landmark findings from a landmark study. And I think one path that was put together here is sort of this process of effects. So what's the process that occurs? So if a study shows these long-term effects, how do you account for it? Some of the early speculation, in the early days, there was a lot of speculation about what it was. But I think the consortium investigator, and this is Richard Darlington and Irving Lazar, put this together that showed early that there was this cognitive change. Obviously, the cognitive advantage hypothesis was a prominent one, in those days, but there were other factors placed in it as well that you're developing not only cognitive skills, but also achievement skills, the whole continuum of developed abilities, leading to reduction in special education placement. And by those processes together, you see changes, direct changes in high school graduation, either directly or indirectly through some of those processes. Now, what does that mean in actual real words? And I think Lazar tried to make this portrait of it, this process, to explain it. Because I think the way that if you explain this process in a way, we can try to identify and replicate that process in programs to make sure that they're there. So I think this is really critical. Here's what Lazar said. You really use his own words. Really, it's about a mutual reinforcement. There's a system of mutual reinforcement between a parent and a child, the teacher and the child, the combination that teaches that academic success is valuable. It is this continuing mutual reinforcement that could be responsible for the long-term effects. A reinforcement system that is started by the child's participation in the changes parent aspirations for the child. This sort of feedback loop can be initiated as easily in a home-based program as it can in a center-based program. So I think that's this responsiveness, this mutual reinforcement that occurs is what is driving that process. And I think it makes sense in a lot of ways and helps to kind of better understand some of these processes as well. Now, I want to sort of just support that by saying that I think that we did an analysis at HCRC of the three studies, some of the other landmark studies, Perry, EPSARI, and CPC, in terms of mapping on the same measures at the same periods of time, looking at ultimately, school achievement age 14, 15. And so the paths that had the same influence pretty much in all three of the projects, the common mechanisms, are on this slide in terms of each study found the same process with the same measurement approaches all the way up to age 15, that there was this initial cognitive advantage. And of course, but remember Ed's point that some of that is motivational. There's a built-in, there's other things that are being measured by cognitive skills. And as a result of that, there's an enhancement of achievement motivation that then helps to reduce levels of special education at age 14, which then leads to higher levels of school achievement at age 15. So these common pathways, sort of identical process, these were really the only processes that completely replicated themselves across the three studies. and many other ones were a 2 or 1 or so. So it shows you this common process that we need to have this early impact, as large an impact as we can early on, and then to carry forward in other kinds of processes as well. Now, in the CPC study, I want to point that sustainability is possible. What I've plotted here is just the raw scores, the raw achievement test scores from the Iowa Test of Basic Skills from age 5 to age 15 for the CPC study. And as you can see here, it shows that initial pattern as the previous slide that I showed, that the pre-K group relative to the national norm. Then in the beginning, and those are that numbers at the bottom row are is effect size and standard deviations. So that's initial cognitive advantage that was shown, a scholastic advantage that continued up to about first grade or so, and then there's a little bit of a decline. But although the effect, there was a drop-off in the initial effect, it was still significant even at age 15 in 9th grade, at the beginning of the high school years. And so it was significant. So this idea of the drop-off, it still is sustained, although not at the same level, and that relative to the national average as time goes on, that sort of those children, even though they got the advantage, that they're a little bit farther apart than the national average as time goes on. And so the two messages there, one is that you can have sustained effects in existing large-scale programs, but at the same time, even if you do have those sustained effects, you need to nurture those environments in K to 3 to make sure that those effects are optimized and are as strong as possible later. And so that's really the next frontier of how to put that together in a more comprehensive way. And so in the volumes, we've tried to address this. I think, and Art mentioned too, certainly we have Childhood Programs and Practices. That was the first book that's really tried to link, some of these processes together that would have that sustainability built in to the effects of the program. But it was all kinds of programs, from home visiting to school integration and other kinds of efforts. In the second book, really the same sort of approach, looking at really health and education, is that interactive influences. And I think that reciprocal influences is what Lazar was getting at, about the mutual reinforcement of both health and education are being very important. And so as we look at the conference theme, today we're looking at sort of sustaining gains. Some of the frameworks are really are based on the framework that I laid out too, that obviously some of the reasons, the ways that we can better sustain effects, to think about it in a positive way, is that one, obviously there's some structural features, program length and age of entry, matter, and we're going to hear that today in this morning. Certainly program quality in terms of curricular, and instructional approaches, teacher qualifications, parent involvement, engagement being sort of program quality factors that are also very important that we can strengthen to lead to these larger sustainability. And also later this afternoon we'll talk about the P3 continuity in terms of alignment and service integration with CPC and what other states around the country are doing in this effort about alignment. And then obviously school quality and context for tomorrow. We're going to look at school support, instructional practice, how instructional practices can advance learning, in preschool to kindergarten and early grades as well. And then at the end of tomorrow, we have a theme where some of the lessons learned from both the longitudinal studies and just accumulated experience of us in the field about lessons learned about sustaining gains, how to make more optimal gains for early childhood. And then have sort of funders panel will be, putting all of this sort of into practice, both a regional and national perspectives, from foundations, from Kate Wolford and Kresge Foundation, Foundation for Child Development, and others will be really focused on this. And, Libby Doggett will be sharing her lessons on this as well. And I wanted to sort of just end on it. The book, in 2001, there was a book the National Research Council put out. It turned out it was the year after, one of the other, books, the Shellenkoff book, really on, and child development. And I think that one of the messages there in the Eager to Learn book was this, that Barbara, fostered, was this idea of, she mentioned, really was taken past is that one clear message to emerge from really the explosion of knowledge is the prodigious enthusiasm and competence for learning shown by young children. And, and then in that same volume in the introduction, that the pace of learning depends really on whether and to what extent the child's inclinations to learn encounter and engage supporting environments. So I think that partly that early enthusiasm for learning is being fostered, and really this eager to learn. The book, I think it's a really under-heralded book, because it's a phenomenal, I think, contribution to what instructional early learning environments, what's important, how much does it matter, over what period of time does it matter, and part of the thing is this idea of enthusiasm, this attitude for learning, this enthusiasm for learning. And I think the idea in this, for our charge for the next 2 days, is I think this, to keep this, how do we keep and ensure that this enthusiasm for learning really continues, for the duration of the early childhood years into the middle childhood years and beyond, that really is our goal. And then the environments, how do we set up the interactive environments, both environment of the child, of the family, and of the community, to really foster these gains in a strong way. And so with that, I want to conclude, and thank you very much.